I encourage all of the conservatives who talk about abolishing the FAA to like take the first flight after the FAA has been abolished, or to eat the first can of sausages.
I don't know how many takers you'll have for that. Well, hello out there in podcast land. I'm Rui Teixeira, your host of the Liberal Patriot podcast. We come at you every couple of weeks with the finest in heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. And no one fulfills that assignment better than Sohrab Ahmari, who is my guest today. Sohrab is a currently U.S. editor of the excellent heterodox site, UK site UnHerd, and we'll talk about that. Till recently, he was a co-founder and editor of Compact, which is an also excellent U.S. heterodox online magazine. Previously, he's been at the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, commentary, and writes for a wide variety of publications. He's written a number of books, most recently Tyranny Incorporated, How Private Power Crushed American Liberty and What to Do About It. And we'll be talking about that. And he also has a forthcoming book, which we'll also be talking about, which sounds very interesting, but I'll save that for a little later, so hang in there. But first, tell us about your new gig at UnHerd. Explain perhaps to people who aren't familiar what UnHerd is, and what are your plans for UnHerd/United States, which is going to be your bailiwick.
Well, it's good to join you, Roy. I'm a big fan of your work and your books and essays, which I've read since I was a wee lad. So UnHerd is a UK publication now nearing 2 decades old. It is in the kind of heterodox space in the sense that we publish writers from across the political spectrum, from like, Marxist literary theorists like Terry Eagleton today to populist thinkers like Christopher Caldwell, people on the right, and everything in between, including old school liberals. And the idea is, it's not committed to one sort of ism, but rather to try to understand the world by testing every worldview and bringing them into conversation with each other. Compact is in kind of a similar space as well. I guess they call it the heterodox space. But no, I'm very much excited because I think we are entering an age where a lot of people in the United States, across the West, are kind of tired of ism ideological clash, at least readers are. And so I see my task as being just sort of explaining what's happening in the world, just this reported opinion with, interesting perspectives that are more just helping readers understand what's going on and to know what's going on. So, kind of going back to what I did at my past, like an op editor at daily newspapers, and bring some of that kind of even tabloidy energy to this space.
So, I mean, as U.S. editor, what does that mean? You're just going to try to bring in more American writers? Because it is a bit UK focused at the moment. Are there any specific people or types of writers you're going to try to bring in as U.S. editor?
Yes, definitely. It's going to be more American content and more content about the United States. It's produced in the United States, as it was in the past. They would publish things about the U.S., but they would be done out of the UK. So we're going to have like locally produced content.
Yeah. I hadn't heard that we declared independence here in the U.S. And,
yes.
No more of this Brits writing about the U.S. Americans for writing about America. I love it.
It's like your local produce, where it's like the farmer's market version of, as opposed to. So look, I'm just beginning to build up my roster of writers. So today I have a piece by Alexander Nazarian, who's a great writer, was White House reporter for Yahoo News. Now he's on freelance, kind of framing this killer in New Orleans, Shamsuddin Jabbar, as this emblematic all-American loser. And it's less about Islamism per se than about kind of too many lives that cash out in this precariousness, failure, and divorce, ending up living in a trailer park. And then jihadism becomes the sort of punctuation mark on that. And then tomorrow I have a piece by Matt Gazda, the rising New York playwright, about a mom's book reading podcast, a books podcast for moms, where the premise is you don't actually read, because the former title of this podcast was "Moms Don't Have Time to Read," and he sends it.
So
he
they
sends
talk
it up.
about what people are talking about in terms of the book they haven't read, or what do they do?
Exactly right. That's what it is. Yes.
Okay.
And Gazda argues that it's as vapid and in some ways dispiriting as that sounds.
Yeah, right. Now, Gaz is an interesting guy. Isn't he a part of that sort of Dime Square crew in New York? Doesn't he come out of that scene, or
he
no?
wrote a play called Times Square, which was very much noticed at the time. This is kind of at a time when the United States was locked down. This was kind of underground cultural energy coming back. But Times Square since then has come to be associated with a kind of hard right, worldview, almost kind of eugenic right. Our mutual friend Michael Lind is a great diagnostician of this stuff. Anyway, and that's not a worldview that Matt himself shares. He just kind of created the scene or described the scene, but his worldview is different somewhat from that.
Yeah. Well, no, I look forward to seeing more of his stuff. I like his writing quite a bit. Now, maybe unless you have something, want to tantalize us a little bit more with stuff coming up on UnHerd US, we can maybe turn to your most recent book, Tyranny Incorporated.
Sure.
Well, why don't you first summarize the basic thesis of it, in words that my erudite but time-pressed audience can understand. What's the basic shtick here, Sohrab?
The basic shtick is that we as Americans are accustomed to thinking and talking about coercion as something that only the public sector, only governmental authorities can do to you, when in fact our lives as market participants, whether as consumers or workers, is shot through with coercion, precisely because, though, the reigning economic ideology, especially in its kind of neoliberal formulation, won't contemplate the possibility of private coercion. It begins to rise to the status of private tyranny because it's very difficult to countervail against it. Our economic lives are inured, I argue, from political contestation. If you get a parking ticket, or if you're charged with a crime or whatever, you can fight in courts, you can rally public opinion, et cetera, et cetera. You can, well, not for a public parking ticket, but you don't have those same mechanisms when you're dealing with an employer, for example, who uses a very devious arbitration clause, and we can get into what arbitration is, to try to prevent you as an aggrieved worker from seeking traditional courtroom justice, effectively denying you justice from any court system, because the arbitration system is this privatized court system where it's run really largely for the benefit of large corporations. You have to pay 16,000 euros for your case to be heard. In a private arbitration chamber in like Geneva, and you might be just a taxi driver, an Uber driver, making $16,000 a year after taxes. So by deferring your case to our private arbitration, effectively you've lost your chance to have your day in court. And this happens all the time. It's a form of coercion, and there's just no way to fight back within the sort of limits of the system as it is.
Now, don't you argue in your book that, this sort of the current iteration of this private tyranny through this sort of neoliberal model is actually in some ways worse, or at any rate different from the previous version of the private sector really, the old style classical liberalism, has some similarities here, but there are also some differences, I think you argue in your book, in terms of, in a sense, it makes it even worse in terms of the relationship between the state and some of these problems that people experience in the workplace.
Yeah, I think there is a distinct difference in the sense that I turn to Michel Foucault here.
All right, Foucault. We name check Foucault. We love it.
Whatever you might think of Foucault on other matters, he was actually a very early prophet of neoliberalism. In fact, he used that term as early as the mid 1970s to describe the thing that was emerging at a time when we were still you could say we were still toward the end of the New Deal order in the United States and the social and Christian democratic order in Europe. Foucault saw it coming, And his argument was that the classical liberal argument says, just let the market be alone, let the market be this autonomous thing. Whereas what neoliberalism does in his famous formulation is, quote, it governs society by the market, so that market-based metrics begin to invade even areas of life where you don't think markets have any place. So, for example, the provision of common goods like water and all sorts of other things that people used to take for granted as part of the commons, that also becomes marketized. Or public tolls, toll roads, parking meters, etc., things that you think of as governmental functions get contracted out to private firms in the name of efficiency. Now, I report in my book that often all it does is enrich kind of fee-skimming middlemen, and that as well. But that's the kind of it's a sort of invasion of the market into areas even that classical liberal thinkers originally would not have thought of.
Yeah, and it's with the assistance of the state. So frequently, so if it isn't, it's not just leave it to the market. If it isn't marketized, let's market it, and let's employ the the mechanisms of formal authority to try to do that, to try to enhance that, because it will produce inevitably the greatest good for the greatest number, which I suppose is similar to the views of classical liberalism, but just extending it much, much farther. Yeah, that's kind of appalling when you think about it. But here's a question I have for you, based on the reception to your book. I read the book, but I also kind of looked around to see what other people had said about it. And I thought it was fascinating that on the one hand, the people on the more conventional right are just the steam was coming out of their ears. How could this guy say this stuff, about this private coercion? Oh, come on. It's the government's the real problem. You should be able to do what you want if you have your own firm. And, he's taken leave of his senses, obviously. There's nothing conservative about this. But then on the left, where you're basically making an argument that would be familiar to social democrats, which presumably most people on the left feel some kinship with. And their reaction was, who is this guy? He's just conservative. What is he talking about? I mean, he doesn't accept the full, 25-point plan that progressives have. So even though he's saying all this stuff that sounds like it's progressive or sympathetic to where progressives are coming from, you can't trust this guy. He hasn't sworn the allegiance to the full, long list of things. So, and he's not, he doesn't realize when you have to defend rights for all these different groups and subgroups of people. And that's what, I mean, I was just struck by it was hard to find anyone who just said, hey, this is if you were on the left, shouldn't you say, hey, this is great. This is this guy associated with the right. He's basically endorsing a lot of social democratic approaches to the workplace, to the role of the state. And, maybe he doesn't agree with us on everything, but that's fine, and this is a good thing. But the reaction to it didn't seem to be that it was a good thing. It was more, again, as I say, who is this guy? I mean, this fake leftist who's actually conservative. So tell me, what was your reaction to all that? Were you surprised by this set of reactions?
Well, it's interesting. My favorite was the New York Review of Books. Of course, my publisher was thrilled that I got a review in the NYRB, and we took out the bit that was blurby for the back of the book for Amazon, and it's it says quote, a scathing and fairly effective attack on neoliberal finance capitalism. Now that addition fairly is such a bitchy thing to say, but the funny thing is that all around it is but Sohrab Ahmari is a really bad guy. Yeah, so just keep that in mind. He's saying some good things, but he's really bad. So Phil, I mean, for me, the deepest wellspring of where this stuff is coming from is not the desire to, get the kind of even Sohrab Ahmari kind of praise from the NYRB or the Washington Post or whatever, but rather it comes from my Catholic worldview. And, Catholicism, Catholic social teaching is not so neatly pegged into this or that box, as you know.
Right.
One of the favorite things that I like to do especially when I address right of center Christian or Catholic audiences, is I read certain quotes, and I'll be like, well, of course, as Karl Marx said, the rise of industrial capitalism has immiserated the many while empowering a few. and so on and so forth. There's all these injustices involved. Workers are oppressed. And I say, only after I'm done reading the quote, I say, actually, that wasn't Marx or Rosa Luxemburg. It was Pope Leo XIII who said that, or it was Cardinal Edward Manning. So to me, the project of social democracy and Christian democracy, again, the New Deal order, as it took shape in the United States, is not a left-wing or radical project. It's actually a project of social stabilization. And this is known to lots of Marxists will say this, and that's why they hate the New Deal order, right? They say that the New Deal order was a way to reconcile the contradictions of capitalism rather than allow them to reach a kind of revolutionary point. And I don't want to reach a revolutionary point. I want a society that's stable, and I don't think it's ever possible to completely do away with all hierarchies. But you can make them more humane, and you can balance different social forces, as classical and Christian social thought has always said. You need the various social estates, estates, to kind of balance each other, countervail each other, and that's what you get when you have an order characterized by, yes, we have capitalism, yes, we have banks, but we also have strong labor unions, we have strong churches, we have consumer co-ops, we have electricity co-ops, all these kind of forces that, in the classic John Kenneth Galbraithian way, put in their push and pull with each other, achieve a degree of social stability. That's a deeply conservative vision to me. It's not a left vision. And so, when I read these reviews, they say, "Hey, he's getting some things right." I think I always think, well, yeah, but I'm not doing it to please you. It's because this is where my worldview, I think, naturally actually leads me.
Yeah, I think a lot of people on the left don't understand, because they don't know the history of the evolution of the welfare state, especially in Western Europe, where a lot of the welfare state was built by Christian Democrats, right? I mean, not just social democrats. There was more or less a consensus about a certain kind of approach to running society and trying to deliver prosperity for the most people and having a stable social order and so on. It wasn't just the social democrats. There was a certain settlement that enveloped and included the Christian Democrats, and they made important contributions. But what about your friends on the right? I mean, you say this kind of vision that you have, or what you're arguing for, is deeply conservative, but boy, a lot of people certainly don't see it that way. Is that is that an effect of the continuing influence of sort of a libertarian stance on economics that's essentially divorced from any, conception of the common good? The old Thatcherite, there's no such thing as society. What's behind it, and how do you think that view is faring at this point? I think that's an interesting question. I mean, how many holdouts are there at this point on the right to the idea that we should just let well enough alone, and private sector imperatives are untouchable, basically? They should be able to do what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I think the most kind of old school Thatcherite, Reaganite types, I shouldn't call them my friends, or I couldn't call them my friends, also more hostile to me than anyone else. Of course, they're still there. They're institutionally strong, right? They have, there's always some high net worth individual, millionaire or billionaire who's willing to fund the next Center for Freedom Studies at the Institute for Freedom and Liberty. So many of them churning out this kind of stuff, almost like the catechism. It's often you encounter the young kind of intellectuals that they're nurturing. There's just no depth there. They just know their, Milton Friedman. They just know their Hayek. Nothing around it. Or not. However, on the obviously the right that's winning office is a much more contradictory and messy thing. I mean, there's we can talk specifics. We can talk like the incoming Trump administration. On the one hand, it does have this techno-libertarian wing, which is radical. I mean, this creature called Doge and all of that, Elon Musk and Vivek. At the same time, you have a Trump administration that has backed the longshoremen on opposing automation. President-elect Trump sent out his social media post saying, "I've studied everything about automation. I've concluded the cost in displacement of workers is not worth the candle for automating courts." Or he just appointed Secretary of Labor, who is only one of 3 Republicans to not only support but sponsor the PRO Act, which is a labor movement number one legislative priority. So, there's something interesting happening, and it's just very hard to see which of these forces will win out. Because if Republicans want to continue to maintain this increasingly downscale, working class, lower middle class base, they can't be listening to Elon Musk on entitlements, right? Entitlements are overwhelmingly popular, including among Republicans. Cutting entitlements is not popular with anyone. At the same time, these figures, these individuals, the tech barons and so on, wield enormous influence on the new right. So I don't want to say that the old kind of libertarian ideas are totally dead. I think that would be inaccurate. I think the right is in this kind of space of contestation and conflict, maybe even between these different impulses. I'm even like a kind of very oddball in this case. I'm a defender of the administrative state. I think complex economies need complex administration. Congress can't make minute rules about how aircraft land and what kind of technology they need for that, and yet we need the FAA. And I encourage all of the conservatives who talk about abolishing the FAA to take the first flight after the FAA has been abolished, or to eat the first can of sausages.
I don't know how many takers you'll have for that, but it's a reasonable challenge.
So, however, what I will say is for a lot of conservatives, especially after the pandemic, the administrative state was experienced as something that was genuinely coercive and irrational and arbitrary. Now you can give it a lot of nuance that, add caveats, but of course it was a public emergency of massive scale, et cetera, et cetera. So, the challenge is to try to win the argument as best one can against the kind of techno-libertarians by saying, look, yes, just because something can be abused doesn't mean it doesn't have legitimate use. Administrative state can be abused, it makes mistakes, et cetera, et cetera. We have to find ways to correct for that. Maybe greater presidential authority so that bureaucrats are more accountable to elected leaders or what have you. But the thing itself is useful. We'll see. I mean, some days I feel very optimistic about this. Some days not so much. Right. So, for example, when Representative Lori Chavez-Durimer was tapped as Secretary of Labor, that was a clear win. We at Compact commissioned an op-ed by Sean O'Brien, the president of the Teamsters Union, in which he endorsed her for the job, and then 24 hours later, she did get the job. So it's okay, well, there's something happening on the right. It is very, very unusual for a Republican president to appoint someone who wants to make it easier for workers to unionize.
Right.
On the other hand, on other days, you get other outcomes, the tech barons lining up behind expanding even the H-1B program, which is a kind of indentured servitude, because they want cheap tech labor. So it's open, it's up for grabs.
It's all to play for. I think we're all waiting for with bated breath is when it's President Trump wants you to join the union. That would be echoing FDR from the 1930s. That would be something. But there are all these very disparate strands, right? You have your techno-libertarians, you have your pro-labor populist Republicans like Josh Hawley and Marco Rubio, who both endorsed your book and have nice blurbs on the back. Then you have more traditional conservatives still, who basically are more sort of a relatively uncompromising free market economics orientation. Then obviously there are business interests that still support the Republican Party, who are very much into that. And it is, I think, what one is looking for here, if it's going to be successful, is some sort of fusion between these different strands, a sort of deal that could be brokered between them, where they would find a way to move forward sort of more or less together. But it sounds like you're not altogether sure that is going to happen. Well, that's fair. But are you even sure it could happen? Right? How feasible is it to move this set of forces together in the same direction, at least even vaguely?
Yeah, I think the key here is the labor movement. If the labor movement is able to find an institutional home in the Republican Party in the way that it has with Democrats. Now we can talk about almost the labor movement has gotten too close to the Democrats to its own disadvantage. But to have an organized vote within the Republican Party to reflect the fact that lots of working class people, at least in certain sectors, might say sectors that involve tangible toil, workers there are much more likely to vote for Republicans. For them to now be a part of the party that represents them would be very helpful. And so this is about a task of like trust building between the mainstream of the labor movement and the Republican Party. And it's very difficult. Why is that difficult? Because I blame mostly Republicans since post Nixon was the last president who competed for the labor vote. The labor movement has only gotten the back of the hand from Republicans.
I mean, a lot of just outright dislike unions and are willing to say they dislike unions, right? So
yes,
that's not very encouraging. Yeah.
Whereas like neoliberal Democrats would still give them crumbs at least, or at least pay lip service.
Right.
So it's understandable why things have turned out the way they have, but things are changing. I think it's very important for the mainstream of the labor movement to notice opportunities and see what they can achieve. I believe in small trust building incremental steps. There are things that the labor movement does very well, like workforce development. And even as Trump wants to reshore manufacturing, we need to have a workforce that's capable of doing those jobs. And so that's something the labor movement can give. On the other hand, there are things that the Republicans should invite the labor movement to take part in. Conversely, I think it would be a mistake for the labor movement to join a second resistance this time around, or to continue to punish, Republican office holders at whatever level on their, for example, congressional scorecards, or how they talk about an administration for things that have nothing to do with bread and butter labor issues, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah,
even Representative Chavez DeRemer has a 10% rating from the AFL-CIO scorecard. This is a person who supports, again, the PRO Act. This is the one piece of legislation that the labor movement wants more than anything. But she doesn't vote on other stuff, some of which have nothing to do with
right. It's just part of the general liberal agenda.
Yeah, just but basically, like, do you agree with Democrats? No, then you get a low score. So,
right.
Are you a Democrat? No, you get a low score. So, like, there has to be this kind of brave leadership on both sides, willing to break through that mistrust that's built up over decades for complicated reasons.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about unions, because you do specifically, because you do talk a lot about it in your book, leaving aside the political element of it. You basically argue that this is the real agent of countervailing power to private tyranny. Has in the end really needs to be unions. There needs to be organizations of workers. And yet, of course, we're in a situation now where it's just incredibly difficult to get unions organized, even if you pass the PRO Act, right? I mean, how much difference would that make? I mean, our mutual friend Mike Lind argues rather strenuously that, organizing on a workplace by workplace basis is in the end a fool's errand. You can't be that effective. You can't accumulate enough power. And there really has to be institutional changes in the bargaining mechanisms, such as, for example, sectoral bargaining. I mean, what do you think about that? Do you agree that is in fact necessary, that without that, it's going to be pretty hard to build up the countervailing power you're talking about?
And I think the point that Michael and lots of other people raised, the real challenge there is the issue of like macroeconomic conditions, which is the nature of the jobs that we have today are just harder to organize for mounting countervailing power. And just, workers are in this kind of gigafied jobs where separate from each other. It's not the kind of factory labor where you're standing next shoulder to shoulder. And as Michael points out rightly, even if you manage to boost the manufacturing share of GDP, which I want to do, imagine you want to do, President Trump says wants to do, right now it's about 8%, which is shameful for an industrial country. Germany is at 24%, even after all the losses of the past couple of years. It's still a quarter manufacturing or manufacturing related. So even if you boost that, the share of the manufacturing share of the workforce won't tick up much as a result of that. And so, that's one of the challenges that Michael points out. I agree with. Like, well, how do you how do you get to organizing? Maybe the answer is having sectoral bargaining. Something that, of course, Michael favors. My friend Oren Cass, whom you probably know as well, favors sectoral bargaining of some form. Even, I should say, J.D. Vance, the vice president-elect, in interviews with me on the record, has said he favors sectoral bargaining. But it's like that. But even there, the question becomes, why would the employer class sign up for that, right? what pressure?
Yeah, right. Well, that's a question our friends on the left ask about that, and about sort of, in a sense, your whole general project. I mean, it's like, okay, the Republican Party, there are green shoots or signs of movement, but basically it's still the Republican Party. And what are you going to do about that? How can you really get these people on board with something that's truly pro-worker? And therefore, the implication is, really, why don't, back to the Democratic Party? I mean, at least they're nominally pro-union. That's what most union members vote for. Why even bother to worry about what's happening in the Republican Party when the Democrats are a better bet? So what would you say to that kind of argument?
Well, I would say it doesn't matter what choice I make. I mean, of course, I'm a man of the right. There's for all sorts of complicated reasons. But the fact is that working class people themselves are shifting, right? Among households that make between 30,000 to 100,000 a year, which is actually a pretty decent proxy for the working class, as opposed to the very poor are below 30%.
I agree.
That majority went for Trump. Half of Hispanic men, quarter of African American men, et cetera, et cetera. Non-college educated Americans, et cetera. These are all decent proxies for working class, and they're moving. So, this is happening. Partly it's for cultural reasons, things that you pointed out, for example, through this concept, which is wonderful, which is, by the way, I'd love to talk about the shadow party on the right, because the right has its own shadow party. It's just different. It just acts differently and looks different, but it exists. Anyway, the shadow party has shifted the Democratic Party into bizarre positions, like Kamala Harris being told by Trump at the debate that you support, public funding for transgender surgery for illegal migrants in jails, in detention. And the ABC moderators corrected him and said, President Trump, she hasn't said that. And then like a day later,
right. And people were writing about it after the debate. Can you believe what Trump made up? It's like,
yes. And then they had to run a correction. It was a funny moment. Right. But the point is that for whatever reason, for all sorts of complex reasons, this shift is happening. And so, we should want, if you actually care about the working class, you should want, a labor movement and a working class that has influence on both parties and can be courted by both parties, be feted by both parties. That's a nice place to be in for working class people. It just means that it's a challenge for both parties that they have to meet those demands, service those needs. And you know what? If the Republicans don't do it, if they just end up running an Elon-style hyper-libertarian administration, they'll be punished for it.
Workers will bail out right and left. I think that's a very good way of putting it. That working class is much better off having their vote competed for rather than assumed to be solely aligned with the Democratic Party. If that competition is real, then I don't see how you wouldn't benefit from it. I think the problem for a lot of people on the left is that they can't wrap their minds around the idea that any self-respecting working class person, of course, of which most of them are not, would even conceive of voting for the Republicans. Are evil. They're like tools of Satan. They're the bad people. Democrats are the good people. So, but that's not a political analysis. That is just like an emotional reaction, and to some extent a tribal identifier. And they'd be well advised to get over this. But since we're talking about culture, let's maybe conclude here by talking a little bit about your forthcoming book, which I believe is called The Triumph of the Normal. At least that's your working title. Tell us about that, because I think that definitely intersects with this whole conversation about the working class and what it wants and the differences between Democrats and Republicans. And as you, I think, wrote an article in Compact, what was it, something like Trump won the war over normal? So that's the kind of thing that makes my friends on the left, makes our heads explode. So Explain that to us.
Well, I mean, normal is a relatively novel concept as we use it. The word only emerged in the 19th century among French physicians, and later on it took on this statistical cast where it's like normal is what is frequently observed. And then it came into popular use in that way only in the mid 20th century. So that in the early 20th century, if you said someone is a normal guy, it would have actually puzzled most ordinary people, which is so unbelievable because, and my argument is that despite that, normal describes something that is very real, that when it's taken away, we notice it. Like, for example, during the pandemic, when we couldn't shake hands, we lost that sense of normal human conviviality and community. And so the pandemic event showed us that there is such a thing as normal, even if, its parameters are contestable, even though the word itself is novel, even if the word has been used in the past to exclude people in unjust ways, which is certainly true. This normal was associated with, in part, with like kind of eugenic racism in the late 19th century, with kind of very coercive Freudian psychiatry. Everyone was treated as abnormal, and that psychiatrists wielded too much power over people who maybe had mental illnesses, but they weren't abnormal and so on. Despite those flaws, I argue that the concept of normal has value, and that for the right, it should give us some faith, because the events of the pandemic and lots of other events that I'll document in the book, and even historical ones, show how normal does kind of prevail in the long term, right? And that sense of like human beings are social, human beings like family, are like to work, they like to be creative, and so on. That will never go away. So to conservatives, it's actually a counsel of calm. This book, it says, look, if you believe that to be the case, then human nature is not one liberal policy change away from being abolished. But to the left, it says you have to come back to normal, to the middle. A progressive movement should stand for the ordinary, the regular, the normal, and not the kind of always the exotic. Even though there is something to the critique of normality, which actually the greatest of them, of course, comes from, again, Foucault, right? There's a reason why he's such a frequently cited figure, and he obviously squarely targeted the concept of normal and normalization, in part rightly so. But nevertheless, I mean, the argument of the book is it has value. And so, I have this line in it, which I hate to do this because it's kind of a spoiler, but I say, like, if normal didn't exist, we'd have to invent it, which we did.
All right. Yeah. I mean, and I think part of your analysis, as I understand it, or your argument, is that what's happened in recent times is a certain version of normality, which isn't very normal or whatever, has been in a sense imposed upon people. They've been told by people who presume they're their betters that this is the right way to do things, to say things, to think about things, the language to use. I mean, it's kind of coming down from above. It's telling people this is what the version of normality that we must all endorse and we must, in a sense, enter into, but it's divorced from, in any underlying sense, what people think of as normal.
And it's also
creates this contradiction, obviously.
It's an anti-normative normality. I mean, that's the paradox.
Right, exactly.
Is that it's like, well, we can't assume there are two sexes. We can't assume that, et cetera, about people. And this is because we have problems with normal, right? That's the premise of this kind of thinking, is that normal is suspect, et cetera. But funny enough, that way of thinking about normal itself becomes normative, right? So that if you are a striving upper middle class young person, you learn to state your pronouns and so on and so on. So it just shows you that normal and normalization and normativity are just unavoidable in human affairs. We are just the kind of norm-creating organism. And so a certain kind of anti-normative normativity is now collapsing, is one of the arguments of the book.
Yeah,
anyway,
I think it is.
One shouldn't talk about a book that's I've only written like 4,000 words.
Well, 4,000 down, 80,000 to go, whatever.
That's so scary. Don't say that.
But yeah, I mean, I think that this it's a very important argument, as I think it looks like you're going to make, and that I think tentatively I'm in agreement with. You will elaborate it at great length, but I mean, we really are in a we live in funny times now, because to some extent, what we used to think of as normality, or aspects of it that I think are arguably really are normal. I mean, they became, in a sense, almost demonized or looked down upon, and in a sense, exotic behavior got, sort of pumped up. I mean, like, sort of the right way to be is completely different than what you ever thought of as normal. So it's like what's bad is good and what's good is bad. What's normal is not normal. What's not normal is normal. So it really has been topsy-turvy, I think, for, as it were, the median voter, who is asked to believe, as they said in Alice in Wonderland, 2 or 3 impossible things before breakfast. And I think it's an unstable situation. And I think that's part of what you're getting at is things have a certain, things will snap back eventually. They must, they will. And they already are to some extent. So you buy that?
Yeah.
All right. It was just.
I'll sign up to that tentatively.
All right. Yeah. Well, at least you and I agree on all this. So, but we'll get everybody else in line eventually. And I do think we're in a vibe shift. I really do. I think your book, when completed in short order, will be part of that vibe shift, because I do think people are sick and tired of being sick and tired. They just want, enough with the bullshit. And, I think everyone will be happier as things move in that direction. So, Rob, I eagerly await your new tome, and I urge people to read your old tome, Tyranny Incorporated, as well as to follow all this good stuff that's going to be coming out on UnHerd, particularly the UnHerd US sort of part of the enterprise, of which you will be, the chief bottle washer. So it's all good, man. And I thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And, if you're ever in Washington, come by AEI and I'll take you to lunch.
Sounds really good, Ray. Thank you.